So in 2016, the state of North Carolina passed a bill. It was called the Public Facilities Privacy and Security Act. You may have also heard it called the Bathroom Bill. Sounds like a great idea, right? Who doesn't want privacy and security when they're using the bathroom? However, behind this seemingly innocent title held some pretty dangerous legislation. The legislation said that anyone using the bathrooms in a public building, so government buildings, school buildings, state college buildings, had to use the bathroom that matched their gender identity on their birth certificate, regardless of their current gender identity. And there were 16 other states considering a similar bill that year. But North Carolina was the only state to pass that bill, and a year later, they repealed the bill. Why? Because of corporations. Corporations pushed back hard. PayPal took away a facility that they were going to build in the state that would have brought in billions of dollars of income. Organizations like the NCAA, the NBA, and other major concert promoters canceled events that would have brought in a lot of people. And companies from Adidas to a number of investment banks to Airbnb pushed at the state to repeal this legislation, threatening to pull their business from the state. And it worked. It worked. The legislation was repealed. This is called corporate socio-political activism. It's an area that I study. Corporate socio-political activism is when companies get involved in or take a stand on an issue that is maybe a little bit out of the realm of what their product focus is. And we see this increasing. We see this activity increasing, partly because what the data shows us, like this a slide here from Edelman, which is a large communications firm that studies the idea of trust, is that trust in the government is at an all-time low. In fact, people trust businesses more than they trust government, and the same kinds of studies show us that people look to businesses to address some of these social issues that they don't trust government to address. And the data shows us that we want companies to do this, and we hold companies accountable for this. So corporate socio-political activism can take many forms. You've seen these examples. You've probably seen advertisements that promote a feminist message. You've probably seen posts on social media that support movements like Black Lives Matter. You've probably heard CEOs talk about issues like immigration rights or refugee rights, and more recently, companies taking on issues like women's reproductive health. And this kind of activism has been increasing since, really in the last decade and since 2016 particularly, because we're asking companies to take these stances. And when they don't take stances, or when companies stay silent, we call them out on it. We want them to be more vocal. So unless you've been hiding under a rock, you're probably very aware that last year, Florida passed a bill. It was called the Parental Rights and Education Bill, also a very innocent sounding name. You're probably more familiar with the term Don't Say Gay Bill, which says that teachers in public schools at certain levels cannot talk about issues of sexual orientation or gender identity. And unless, again, you've been living under a rock, you're probably very aware that Disney is a very large entity in the state of Florida. It brings in billions of dollars of revenue to the state of Florida. And Disney itself is, of course, a very powerful company. And so this was a moment when Disney could have stood up and really pushed back against this legislation. Disney's initial response was pretty lackluster. They tried to sort of fly under the radar. They released an internal memo that said, we do support our LGBTQ employees, but we're not going to make a public statement because corporate statements are divisive. They can be weaponized. And people pushed back. Customers pushed back. Employees pushed back. Even the descendants of Walt Disney himself, the founder of the company, pushed back. And Disney had to take a stronger stand. Now, Disney could probably be doing more, and this kind of a push at Disney may push them in that direction. But what these examples show us is that, first of all, in the case of North Carolina, companies have power. Companies have power to affect social change. In this case, in similar cases, we can see that customers, employees, and investors have power to encourage companies, to push companies to address these social issues. So at this point, a question that often comes up for me, I teach this in classroom situations, and a question that often comes up is whether this is a good thing for society that we are so reliant on companies to do this kind of work for us. And I think that is a really good question, and one that you should be asking, that we should all be asking. That's another TED Talk, and it could fill an entire other TED Talk. I study corporate activism, and I study what companies do to support some of the messages that they put out. And so what I want to focus on is the fact that we are at this place where we are reliant on companies, we are pushing companies to take these social stances. So how can we ensure that companies are doing it responsibly and effectively? How can we use our power to ensure that? So I'll give you some example from a previous study that I did. And to give you some context for the study, we'll go back to 2004 with the Campaign for Real Beauty, as mentioned previously, done by Dove. And this was a moment in time, probably the first moment in time, where a company had really addressed this issue of body image, women's body image in advertising, and repositioned it in a really positive way. And it was really successful for Dove. And other companies saw this, and they began to think about their own messages and their own advertisements. How were they portraying women? How could they support women? Beneficial for the company. And then, of course, we had the Me Too movement. And the Me Too movement raised the sort of dialogue around women's issues in the workplace and women's rights issues as well. And so we began to see advertisers creating what we call femvertisements. And so you have seen these ads. These are ads that promote positive messages about women. It can be about body issue. It can be about gender equity in the workplace. It can be about the judgment calls that we make around women. And this became so ubiquitous. There's so many femvertisements out there that the advertising industry began to create awards for femvertisements. And so a group of researchers and I were really interested in femvertisements and really understanding what else were companies doing. These companies that were winning these very prestigious awards, what else were they doing to support women? Were they just putting out these messages, or were they doing more? And so we spent a winter watching these advertisements. It's a great way to spend a long Ithaca winter. And these are really good advertisements. These are advertisements that any Ithaca College Park School student should be proud to go out and make, right? These are advertisements that made us feel really proud to identify as women. They made us laugh. They made us cry. They really garnered emotion. And in fact, the data shows us that women, a majority of women, say they will make a purchase from companies who create these advertisements, that they feel that empowers them. And in fact, a majority of women also say that they believe that femvertisements dismantle gender barriers. So what did we find when we studied these award-winning companies? Unfortunately, the results were not half as inspiring as these ads themselves. So I'll give you just a few highlights. First of all, we did find that companies that won awards for femvertisements weren't doing a whole lot more than companies that had not won award for femvertisements in terms of pulling women up inside of the company, supporting women inside of companies, and also external work. Doesn't mean they weren't doing anything, but they just weren't doing anything more. So they made great advertisements, but they weren't doing much more. We also, probably not a surprise to many of you, found that the board of directors for most of these award-winning companies were heavily male. Very few had even 50% of women on the board. I think there were 2. And there were 3 of the companies that actually had 50% of women in leadership positions. So women weren't in these decision-making positions within these companies that were putting out ads that had messages of equity and equity for women. So it became really clear to us that it is important that we think about how companies, not only what companies are saying, but how they're backing up what they're saying. And so how do we do that? We have power. We have power as customers to spend our dollars wisely, to think about the companies that we're buying from, the products that we're buying. And if we see that companies are not actually doing the work or aligning with our values, we can spend our dollars elsewhere. Companies exist to make money, so we have that power as consumers. We also have power as employees. So in the past 20 years, we have seen an increase in corporate support of LGBTQ rights, and it has increased year over year. This is a phenomenon, actually, that a number of researchers study because it's been such a level of progress in terms of, companies 20 years ago would not address anything related to the LGBTQ community, and now there's sort of like fighting each other for the opportunity to sponsor different events, et cetera. So where did that change come from? The researchers who study this track it to the employees inside the companies. It was employees inside the companies who said, we need better benefits for same-sex marriage. We need to better showcase the LGBTQ plus community in our marketing materials. And those actions were taken, and companies became pushed to address these issues. So employees have power. And finally, if you have money to invest in companies, you have the opportunity to ask for data. You have the opportunity to push companies to tell you what they're really doing, not just what they're saying. And we see more and more investors who are asking for very specific data on environmental, social, and governance support within the companies. And when we ask for this kind of data, we force companies to be more transparent, and we may even force them to be even more proactive in what they're doing. So clearly, as I referenced the femvertising research, we spent months on that research. As consumers, we don't have months to spend to figure out what companies are doing. So how can we realistically understand what companies are actually doing in support of the words they're saying? This is an example I share with you from the summer of 2020. You will recall very clearly, I'm sure, the summer of 2020, a lot of people took to the streets in protest after the murder of George Floyd. And many, many companies began to post on social media their support for the Black Lives Matter movement. And so a group of people, not academic researchers, just really thoughtful people, took it upon themselves to create a shared Google Doc that anybody could contribute to. And so the universe went onto the internet and they filled out this data. And they looked at companies, they listed companies that were supporting Black Lives Matter on their social media feeds and on their websites. And then they listed what the companies were actually doing in support of those words, or not doing in support of those words. So a simple spreadsheet. And that data is easily found. This is all from companies' websites, from companies' reports that they put out in terms of their corporate social responsibility. That data is easily found, so it's easy for us to find that data. So we have the power to do that. We also have the power of social influence. I'm sure all of you are on social media in one form or another. This is an example, again, from the summer of 2020. There was a founder of a makeup company for Black women who saw, again, these companies posting a commitment to racial equity within their companies, and she created a hashtag and an Instagram campaign called Pull Up or Shut Up, which means pull the people who are in marginalized communities up in your companies or stop saying that you support these rights. And she challenged these companies to show what they were actually doing, and companies responded. And this is an ongoing campaign. You can look up her website. Pull up or shut up. So we have these opportunities to really challenge what companies are doing. And this is important because when companies put out messages and they don't back that message up with real action, they're not addressing the systemic issues behind all of these issues. And we as consumers, we see these messages, we think, oh, here's a company that we trust, right? We trust companies more than we trust the government. And they see us, they see the issue, they're addressing the issue, when in fact the systems behind that issue are not being addressed, so we're lulled into this sense of complacency. So it's really, really important that we push companies to do more than just say something. And I know companies are powerful, corporations are super powerful. I know that I can tweet something. I don't have a lot of followers on Twitter. I know that I can decide not to buy a product, and it's not going to bring a company to their knees. It's not going to make my individual actions, not going to make them change. But what we do see is that collective action, movements, we are capable of making companies think about their systems, how they're addressing pay equity inside of their organizations, who they're supporting in communities, right? We can ask those questions and we can push companies to provide those answers. We have that power to do that. So I hope that you will find your own power as a consumer, as an employee, as an investor, and push these companies to back these words up with action. Thank you.